For the remainder of Learning Outcome 2, we're going to talk about secondary data. We need secondary data to learn more about the existing situation and how to solve it. We have two main purposes for using secondary sources. The first is to define your research problem, and the second is that once you actually start doing your research, you can use the work of others to help you solve your problem. We can collect secondary data from many sources, so in this video we're going to talk about some of the most common. One that students are usually required to purchase and use in school is textbooks. Books provide you really great overviews or background, as well as in-depth examinations of very specific topics. Sometimes you can use textbooks at even more than two classes. Like for example, in your accounting course, you can use the same textbook throughout both classes. So they can be a good starting point for learning a lot of introductory material about a topic. However, textbooks can take a really long time to create, edit, and publish, so they usually aren't your most up-to-date resource. Even if you purchase a book, let's say in 2022, it might not have the latest information or current events because they take years to publish. Sometimes ebooks can be more useful because they can be published or updated on a more regular basis. Journals report on original research, and they are on very specific topics, usually written by experts on their field. They are better sources for the latest and greatest breakthroughs in different fields. Journals are usually written by academics and then used by other researchers or students. To be published in a real academic journal, you have to receive peer review. This means that the article needs to be reviewed by other experts in the field to determine if it is accurate and significant before actually being published. Earlier in the course, I did provide you a link to a journal article that I worked on that was published in the Annals of Actuarial Science. That's an example of a peer-reviewed journal. Here's the journal it was published in, and you can read a variety of articles. Here's just some of the examples that you can click on and read if you have access. Usually two main types of journal articles. The first is a review article that actually just summarizes previous research done by other people to try to provide an overview of important findings in the field. That's kind of similar to a textbook. The second kind is a research article. That is original new research on a specific research problem, how they solved it, the results, and the implications I think that will have for the future. Research articles are more common and usually what we'll be using for this course. We will talk a little bit more about the structure of a journal article next. In the notes for this course, I did provide a link to this article on caffeine consumption, insomnia, and sleep duration. It is an interesting example on if consuming caffeine actually influences your sleep. The first thing you always start with for every journal article is the title. So that is the title of this journal article that we're going to look at together. The next element is your abstract. Almost all scholarly articles have this. A good abstract will give you an overview of the entire study. So for example, they start with the objective. Just like we've talked about a research objective, that should have your verb, subject, object. This objective says what the authors were studying and why they did it. In this one, they identify that there's a gap in knowledge where there hasn't been much research, including how both caffeine consumption and sleep duration influence insomnia. Next, they go into their methods. This is where they say how they set up an experiment in this case in order to test their findings. So not all studies will use an experiment. Some might use interviews or observation or surveys, but the methods can give you a little bit more information on if you think the article sounds trustworthy. If you want to learn more about what methods they use, keep reading. Next, they give an overview here of the results. This is the actual findings from the experiment that was conducted. Sometimes you'll have some reported numbers. Here they actually have an average caffeine consumption, for example, and an average hours of sleep. If you think that these could help you with your research, keep reading. Finally, they quickly summarize the conclusion in only one sentence. This can be one of the most important pieces to look at. So if you read the conclusion, and think that this article could help you with your current research, then you might want to go in more detail and read the entire article. So I always say to students, read the abstract first. If it seems related to your topic, read the whole article. If it's not related, do not read the whole article. The abstract is your guide to help you determine if you should keep reading or not. If you should keep reading and go into the article, every good journal article should have an introduction. The introduction should always include your research problem. Remember, the research problem has two different pieces: the research objective, which is the why, and the research questions, which are the what. This will give you a good idea of what's being researched. Generally, it will also have some kind of hypothesis that they wish to test. Sometimes the introduction also has what's called a literature review. This is an overview of other articles that have been written about the same topic. We will discuss in detail in future lessons how to write a literature review, and you will have to do this on an assessment. In this introduction for the specific journal article, the authors do state why their work is important in the first sentence. Then they have bullet points for their hypothesis, where they have clear statements about what they're trying to learn in these point form summaries. The methods section is a longer one where they go into detail about the experiment that they're going to use and the people that they did the experiment on. It can be useful to read this when you're evaluating the article to see if you think it's well done, because good experiments will follow the scientific method. They also include information on who was in the experiment. For this, you should read if you think they have enough people, if it was randomly selected, and finally, they do go into the measures. That's how they're going to measure their findings. So how do they measure caffeine intake? How do they measure sleep? They have detail on both of these. After they say the methods they use, they publish the results. This is usually in some kind of large table or graph. If you're not a math person, sometimes the results section can be a little bit confusing, but my recommendation is always locate the charts, locate the graphs. Don't try to worry about every single statistical finding. We'll learn more about those later in the course. Right now, you just want to make sure that the authors are showing their results so that they are being transparent and clear in their research about what their findings were. Where you can get more information about what the findings mean is in the discussion section. This is kind of like the conclusion to the study. Did they prove their hypothesis? How do the findings change what we know about the topic? And do they have any more questions or something that they couldn't answer after finishing the study? So here in the last sentence of the whole article, they discuss how their findings support what was found in other studies. So they try to make a connection between what was done in the past and what they found in their current study. This is just a quick example, and you can spend more time going through this journal article on caffeine consumption. We'll look at a lot more journal articles as we work on creating our own literature reviews. Because journal articles are so popular, we spent a lot of time talking about their breakdown, but there are other secondary data sources as well. One example is a thesis, a conference proceeding, or an unpublished manuscript. A thesis would be what somebody writes as part of their PhD research. This is not peer-reviewed, but it still is evaluated by the researchers' supervisors when they have to get their PhD, and that can be published information. Sometimes academic conferences also have presentations on important research, but while they're still doing their research and not done it yet, sometimes you can get that information in an unpublished manuscript. For example, I went to a conference before for the Statistical Society of Canada, and a lot of the researchers there were talking about research that they're currently doing, but they had not published it yet. Another example is a report. Reports are super common from Statistics Canada. An example of one. Statistics Canada collects data on trends in the prevalence of depression and anxiety disorders among working-age Canadian adults. They collected this information from 2000 to 2016. You can actually read their whole report here on what their findings were. They go into their own methods, sample. It's not peer-reviewed, it's information directly from the government, so that's what's meant by a report. A newspaper is a great way of getting current information. about what's happening around the world in different areas. One thing you have to be a little bit careful of when looking at newspapers is if there's any political ties. I do provide an example to two different newspapers in the course notes, the Daily Kos and the Daily Wire. You can actually see from their headlines that there are differences in the way that they present information. The Daily Kos is actually considered a liberal news site, whereas the Daily Wire, this one, is a more conservative news site. Once you know this, it's easier to spot the differences in the articles that they publish, and it helps you to be aware that there could be some kind of biases at play because they support different political views. We're actually going to learn more about evaluating sources later on in this learning outcome. The internet is the most popular source for gaining information on topics. It is extremely useful for learning more. However, what you have to be careful about is that the internet can be a little bit unmonitored and unregulated, so the information that you find on it is not always accurate. You'll have to evaluate it for accuracy, which we will learn later on, as I mentioned. And finally, open data sources. They're available for everyone to use, reuse, and redistribute. You can usually get this information from government or city websites. For example, Canada has a Government of Canada open data portal that contains over 85,000 data sets. The Ontario government has almost 3,000 data sets available to use. And the city of Greater Sudbury has actually around 100 data sets that you can look at. An example of some different open data sets would be that the Ontario government publishes findings on fish stocking that they do in lakes all around the province, or results of different hunting activities like the moose draw and tags, for example. The city of Greater Sudbury actually publishes data on the bus routes so people can use it to build apps. They also publish even employees' travel expenses so you can see where your tax money is going, and that information is available for anyone to use and see. These are just some sources of secondary data, and they are the most popular ones that we'll be using in this business research course.